Russia is probably fast approaching a tipping point right now that is very similar to, though less dramatic than, the tipping point of the Black Plague in European history. Wage growth, while every worker loves wage growth, is not always a good thing. Russia's wage growth is inherently unsustainable, and therefore actually very bad news for the average Russian. The pendulum eventually swings to the other direction. In the long term, unemployment will probably skyrocket. Hey guys, Paul Warburg coming to you back from Utah today. Today I am enjoying a very mild Utah winter day. It is currently about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which to some of you might seem cold, but to me feels downright warm, downright hot even. I am trying to embrace this good weather while I can, and generally that is good advice. Embrace the good things while they are there, because nothing lasts forever. And that is advice that should definitely be heeded by every Russian worker right now. Today's video is going to be about Russia's unemployment crisis, which is manifesting itself differently than some people might think. Typically, when we think of an unemployment crisis, we think of unemployment as being too high, with workers unable to find jobs. But right now, Russia has actually the opposite problem, where unemployment is far too low and there are far too many jobs available. Now, at first that might seem like a good thing, but as you'll see by the end of this video, it turns out that this can actually be more devastating to an economy in the long term. So first, let's talk about the numbers. Vladimir Putin has been boasting lately, both to his people as well as on international trips, that in Russia there is basically no unemployment right now. And it turns out that that is actually true. Currently in Russia, the unemployment rate is approximately 2.5%, going up or down a little depending on the given month. And that, at first, seems like a very good thing for Russian workers. And that is true, until you look at the other side of that equation and how it manifests itself for Russian businesses. Currently, 73% of all Russian businesses have been unable to find enough workers, which is creating severe problems. In certain regions, like Moscow in particular, there are 9 job openings for every one available worker, which means that Russian businesses are having a hard time staying in operation, let alone advancing and developing for the future. Now, I always love to bring historical examples into my videos because it is always fascinating to see how similar events have played out in the past. And it turns out that in relation to today's topic, the historical examples are particularly stark. The most dramatic example is probably the Black Plague, which created one of the largest labor shortages in history. Everybody knows the Black Plague was a devastating plague that hit Europe. It actually killed between 30 and 50% of all of Europe's population in a very short period of time, with most of the deaths occurring in just a couple of years, really. And what this did was that it drastically reduced the available population who was able to work under the existing system of feudalism. And because of this, a lot of people actually credit the Black Plague with ultimately creating the circumstances that would lead to democracy in Europe, particularly in England. What happened was that all of these workers who were used to not having any opportunities and used to being under the thumb of their feudal lords suddenly found themselves as the people in their society with the most leverage. Feudal lords could not get rich without any workers, and workers began to find that they could demand more rights. This, for the first time in these regions of the world, gave people this freedom that they were not used to, that ultimately manifested itself in democracy. However, while that was the long-term result, in the short term, things played out through very violent peasant revolts. It turns out that feudal lords who are used to everybody doing everything for them don't really like it when some of their privileges start to be taken away. The feudal lords responded to the peasants demanding more rights, at first by trying to force their wages down artificially to protect basically the businessman class. The peasants, of course, didn't like this, and ultimately they revolted, and there was a lot of bloodshed and a lot of lack of peace in their countries, where things got worse before they got better. That's an interesting episode, and you can learn more about it in the book Why Nations Fail, where I'll leave a link in the description. But as we think through this episode of history, it gives us a very stark backdrop for some things that could soon begin to take place in modern Russia. Russia is probably fast approaching a tipping point right now that is very similar to, though less dramatic than, the tipping point of the Black Plague in European history. And how that plays out and actually manifests itself depends on how the dice roll. And it really all comes down to how things develop as Russia's unemployment crisis continues to develop. But the trajectory is rather clear. And the question is, will that trajectory be interrupted by outside forces, or will it fully play out to its logical conclusion? You see, it turns out that wage growth, while every worker loves wage growth, is not always a good thing. Wage growth can either come from an economy that is very, very healthy or very, very unhealthy. On the healthy side, wages can grow when there is an increase in productivity, either from technology or education or healthcare or things like that. But on the flip side, wage growth can also happen when there is a dramatic upset in the system, like the Black Plague. And Russia's wage growth right now is a lot more akin to that kind of thing than to anything positive. Now, because of all of this, Russia's wage growth is inherently unsustainable, and therefore actually very bad news for the average Russian, unless they manage to cash in their chips and take the rewards of their high wages and get to another country before the reckoning comes. So let's talk about the reckoning. Now, I've shifted views here so you can see the path behind me, because we're going to go on a journey now from Russia's current situation to a very logical and common sense conclusion. When you look at a prosperous economy, it needs two things. It needs to be an economy that is good for both workers and for employers. In a healthy economy, workers earn high wages, but employers at the same time have access to labor that is a low enough cost that allows them to continue to deliver a profit. If you only have one of those two things, and things are skewed one way or the other, it turns out that you don't have a healthy economy, because you are disincentivizing one side or the other from being productive. If unemployment is too high, workers will often become hopeless and will kind of check out of the economy and will be very unproductive. But on the flip side, if unemployment is too low and employers are working very, very hard, but they can't turn a profit because they have to pay all their employers too much, they have no incentives to work hard to build big companies that ultimately provide more jobs in the long term. It is a very delicate balance, it turns out, and these things need to exist in harmony. Now, because of this, there is a healthy level of unemployment, because unemployment is essentially the result of bartering between employers and employees. A healthy level of unemployment keeps things in equilibrium so that neither side gets things too weighted in their advantage and ultimately leads to a catastrophe. In Russia, a healthy unemployment level is considered to be approximately 4%. At that level, things remain relatively stable. Wages remain relatively stable, and employer profits remain relatively stable. And all other things considered, on average, most people are pretty happy. So with that in mind, Russia's unemployment rate today of approximately 2.5%, even though that might seem like good news for anybody who wants a job, is actually very unhealthy because it is very weighted to one side, to the employees. And what that does is it creates a short-term boom, but the pendulum eventually swings to the other direction. The problem is that when employers cannot hire enough employees at a price that allows them to turn a profit, ultimately, the employers are forced out of business. And in particular, when the underlying cause of this is artificial, like in the case of Russia, this can happen to a lot of employers all at once as the bottom falls out. Now, when these employers go out of business, that of course actually eliminates jobs. And so the market is kind of correcting itself from the oversupply of jobs on a pendulum that will then swing to an oversupply of labor. And in Russia's case, this will probably be particularly catastrophic. For a lot of people in the United States, just as an example, we experienced this recently at a much smaller scale. In the United States, there was a boom that was created by COVID in the job market, which led to a very low unemployment rate. And this led to artificially high wages, where employees could basically write their own ticket to fill all of the open jobs that were available. Personally, I was able to switch jobs about 3 times in 8 months and ultimately ended up doubling my pay, more than doubling my pay by doing so. But very shortly after that, as we all know, in the past about year or so, the job market has switched. And now this boom has turned into a bust, at least from the employee's perspective, where there are layoffs going on like crazy because employers cannot afford to carry all of the high wages and all of the high employee counts that they built up during this time. Now, this boom turned bust, I said it was created by COVID, but more accurately, it was created by stimulus packages that were given in response to COVID, was completely artificial. And Russia is experiencing something very similar, but to a very magnified degree. So why is there a job market boom in Russia right now? And why is unemployment so low? Well, it turns out that there are pressures on both the supply side and the demand side. There is drastically reduced supply and drastically increased demand, and most of it does come back to Russia's war against Ukraine. From the war directly, obviously there has been a massive reduction in Russia's available workers for a number of different reasons. Obviously, a lot of people who would normally be working in jobs in the Russian economy are now fighting in Ukraine. And those bodies are unavailable even if nothing bad happens to them. But a lot of bad things are happening to them. And a lot of these Russian workers are dying, or even worse, from a purely financial standpoint, many of them are being catastrophically wounded and disabled and becoming a drag on the Russian economy rather than a net contributor to it. And so we see a lot of this going on, and this has drastically reduced the number of available workers directly. Now, in addition to this, to a greater degree even than the number of people who are fighting in Ukraine, are the number of people on the home front who are now focused on producing equipment for the soldiers in Ukraine. These are people working at Russian arms factories, producing everything from tanks to APCs to helicopters to drones, you name it. There has been a huge pull of Russian workers from every corner of the economy into the defense sector. And this is driving wages up unnaturally just because of the demand, but also because of some specifics about how these workers are being paid. It turns out that the payments going to the defense sector of Russia are all unnatural influxes in the economy, which allows the defense sector to pay unnaturally high wages, which gives other Russian employers no competitive advantage. Now, there's a couple of different levers that Russia has pulled here. The first is that prior to invading Ukraine, Russia saved up a massive wealth fund that they then have been quickly deploying into the economy, particularly from the government to defense firms, since the war in Ukraine began. I have a whole video on this explaining this, but basically, if you think of it from a personal finance perspective, if you went from saving a large portion of your income and then you withdrew all of those savings all at once, that would create a temporary boom for you, and that is essentially what has happened to Russia. They've gone from saving money to deploying money, and that puts a lot of money in the economy really quickly, and that helps drive wages up. There's also another lever that Russia has pulled here, which is that they have been forcing their banks, essentially, to give unfair loans to the defense sector at below market interest rates. And I just created another full video on this one as well, explaining that these loans will basically never be paid back. And so this is money that is being taken from Russian banks, from the rich in Russia, and being deployed to the defense sector. All in total, Russia's savings account that they built up prior was about $640 billion US dollars. About half of that was frozen, and all signs are that they've spent a good portion of that. So that's equal to about $320 billion that has been unnaturally deployed into the Russian economy from that. And then these bank loans have equaled between 200 to 240 billion US dollars that has been deployed into the Russian economy unnaturally. So altogether, that is about $500 billion that have been put into the Russian economy, basically as stimulus. And keep in mind that Russia's federal budget pre-war was only generally about 350 billion US dollars. So Russia has put basically 1.5 of their federal budgets into their economy. And a huge portion of that is manifesting itself in wages for defense sector employees. Now, there's an interesting problem here, which is that the defense sector doesn't care about profitability. They are basically being forced to produce equipment by the Russian government because Russia is waging a war. So the defense sector essentially has no limit to the wages that they are willing to pay to their employees. But Russia's private businesses don't have that luxury. For them to stay in business, they don't have a war that is always going to buy their equipment and keep giving them money and ensure that they stay in business. The private sector of Russia actually has to turn profits. And so what we are seeing is increasingly private sector employers in Russia simply cannot keep up. And like I implied earlier, a lot of them are being forced to close up shop or at least drastically reduce the number of people that they can afford to hire, even though they need more employees. So now what we see then is private sector Russian employers going out of business, with more and more wealth concentrating closer and closer to the top, even more than it already was, towards people that are around the Kremlin's circle of power. In the short term, Russian employees won't see these effects because Russia is still funding the defense sector as long as they can, and so they have plenty of job opportunities available to them. But what we have to ask is what happens when the coffers run dry, and what happens when the war in Ukraine ends. Obviously, when that war ends, no matter how it ends, these Russian defense employers are no longer going to be needed, and the vast majority of them will shut down. All of those jobs will go away. Unfortunately, though, the workers won't have their old jobs to fall back on, because all of their old employers went out of business. And they probably have a bad taste in their mouth now. They might not want to do business in Russia anymore. They might not start back up when everything clears out, because they might be so frustrated at trying to do business in a country that is this corrupt and this inept and makes business so hard. And so what you will see is that while in the short term there is a boom in Russia as far as employees are concerned, in the long term, unemployment will probably skyrocket. So what we then see in Russia's labor market, like so many other aspects of the Russian economy, is that it is built like a house of cards. And very quickly, the whole thing could fall in on itself. And in this area, like so many other aspects of the Russian economy, things won't necessarily be fixed, even if the war in Ukraine ends. In fact, from the perspective of the Kremlin, ending the war in Ukraine and ending that crisis and shutting down defense employment could just spark this crisis right away. So Russia is caught in a catch-22, and that's why I think they are unwilling to end their war against Ukraine right now, even though it is going so badly for them. This is a rat trapped in a corner who doesn't know a way out. There are a lot of additional aspects to this Russian unemployment crisis that I haven't even touched on in this video. From Russia's underlying demographic problem that existed even prior to the war, to Russia's migrant problem, where a lot of their working age people are leaving the country and not a lot of migrants are coming into the country. But this video has been long enough already, so I'm going to go ahead and end this one here. But before I do that, can I ask you for a quick favor? Would you consider becoming a patron of this channel? It's completely voluntary. I'm not planning on putting anything behind a paywall, but just for those of you who find these conversations to be very insightful, entertaining, and important, and you want to see more content like this, it's just a way for you to support the channel if you want to. So if you want to get involved in that, you can scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description of this video. Other than that, I have a lot of other videos on the Russian economy that you'll really enjoy if you enjoyed this one. So be sure to check those out on screen.